Hi, I'm Dan Nexon. I'm your host for this episode of Foreign Entanglements. And today on the show, we have Alex Cooley. Alex, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, Alex here. I'm a professor of political science at Barnard College in New York, focusing on international relations and largely Eurasia. And also, I direct Columbia University's Harriman Institute for the Study of Russia and Eurasia.
And the impetus for having you on the show today is that you are the author of a really interesting book that came out this year called Dictators Without Borders, Power and Money in Central Asia, which you co-authored with John Heathershaw. Could you tell us a little bit about that book?
Yep. So Dictators Without Borders is a dive into reconceptualizing how we think about political contestation and authoritarianism and kleptocracy in the region. And its basic premise is that even though Central Asia is a space of authoritarian and dynastic rulers, that in fact there is a significant amount of political contestation, but it takes place outside of the region. It takes place in the form of exiles and exile politics, governments going after political opponents overseas through various mechanisms, such as Interpol red notices, accusations of money laundering, international arbitration proceedings. And it's also focused in on how Central Asian rulers and their families try to normalize themselves and globalize their own identities by having multiple residencies, passports, luxury real estate, dense transnational ties to their charities and cultural organizations. So it's kind of this inside-out dynamic where if you're, just to look at the region and say, what are oppositional politics in Kazakhstan, you're not going to find a lot. But if you expand the terrain to include sites like Switzerland or London or New York even, then actually you'll find quite a lot of political contestation. It's just not how we normally study it. And this is a project that I've co-authored John Heathershaw from the University of Exeter, who's also, previous to this joint work, he explored a lot of the global dynamics of Tajikistan, right? One of the most remote stands, and especially how its main economic asset, the Tajik Aluminum Company, was embedded in offshore networks, international disputes, and in fact had consumed one of the most expensive court cases in UK history back in the 2000s. So really what we wanted to do is knock back what we think of these popular myths about Central Asia that drive both policymakers and academic studies, right? The first one is this idea that Central Asia is so isolated, right, that it lacks connectivity. That's sort of the big kind of buzzword. And in fact, what we show is that, no, the region has lots of connectivity. It's just not the kind of connectivity we like to think about. It's less about infrastructure, but the connectivity it has is to the global financial and legal system, intermediaries who broker deals, the extensive use of offshore vehicles to structure deals, whether they're sales of energy companies or the brokering of fuel contracts with foreign militaries, or just the kinds of corruption scandals that we've seen involving prominent government officials in the region, such as in the area of telecoms in Uzbekistan. What we show is a lot of connectivity to the global system. It's just not the type that we usually think about promoting. So that's the overall purpose, is to really, lift the curtain behind what we think are actual political dynamics that don't get as much attention as really we think they should.
So essentially in the region, what you focus on is that there are a large number of oligarchic elites, right? And kleptocrats. Everybody's kind of tied up in governments. And they are using these kinds of mechanisms essentially to get their money into safe havens, to launder that money, to, essentially give it legitimate fronts, even though it's looted from their countries or from businesses. Is that what's going on, essentially?
Yeah. One way to think about it is, this is the counter case to the standard account of globalization and integration that we think about in terms of Eastern Europe, right? In Eastern Europe, you think about what happened to the political and economic transition in the 90s. Well, it was overdetermined, right? In essence, you had a lot of FDI from Europe come in. You had the accession process of countries that wanted to get in the European Union and NATO having to accept reforms in the political and the economic realm. And then you had a kind of Europeanization of politics and political turnover sort of take place through certainly the mid-2000s anyway. We can get into some of the backlash later. But all of this was really a very peculiar type of transition that was, in part determined by the numerous sort of transatlantic architectures that East Europe found itself in. Central Asia presents a different paradigm. It's a paradigm of elites and authoritarians who are furiously engaged in a process of state consolidation and state building, who are not looking at prospects of joining the European Union or any kind of, Western organization in a meaningful way. But however, they have access to the world of global finance, intermediaries and bankers, fixers and brokers, and have developed a different path through which globalization for them is used to enrich themselves and use sort of the tools of globalization for private purposes, as well as to then improve their image overseas when they can as well. And just, the sophistication of this has evolved, right? And let me give you sort of one before and after example. So 1990s, the scandal that was known as Kazakhgate broke out that involved allegations that the Kazakh elite, then President Nazarbayev, had been embroiled in a number of pay-to-play Western fuel contracts, half a dozen of them, that had been brokered by this fixer, James Giffen, who had created a set of intermediary accounts in Switzerland to facilitate these Western sort of fuel contracts. Now, in some ways, Kazakhgate was sort of settled when Giffen pled guilty to a violation of the FCPA, but he used
the FCPA being
the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act. He used a very novel defense, actually, which was kind of a public authority kind of defense, where he said, yes, that he did many of the things that he was accused of, but that he was also acting in concert with and knowledge of U.S. intelligence services, the State Department, and so forth. And the judge in the sentencing sort of thanked him for his service for it. But this is kind of, the story of one man brokering and being this sort of fixer between outside energy companies, right? And sort of, this, retaining sort of the, providing the access rather to this ruling family and ruling elite. What we have now sort of, 10, 15 years later is something of much greater sophistication, right? It's a world in which these Central Asian elites themselves are quite savvy at accessing a lot of these really global service providers, right? Whether they're international bankers, whether it's the accountants and lawyers that set up and facilitate offshore transactions. And I think, one of the things that the Panama Papers sort of revealed is just the industrial nature, right, of the production of a lot of these sort of shell companies and offshore vehicles. So there's an increasing sort of sophistication where each of these nodes, right, these alternative sides of globalization, plays its role in sort of globalizing and normalizing the conduct of these officials. Now, what I think is sort of the key analytical point that we've missed, I think, or not emphasized, is we've had a lot of work on the illicit economy, right? And transnational illicit networks, narcotics, drug trafficking, and so forth. But I think one of the things that the book explores is how the commingling of licit and illicit funds takes place within accepted and unregulated sectors, right? And so I think, luxury real estate and global luxury real estate is one of those sectors because we have such poor regulation, such poor oversight in the US, but in really all top 10 luxury real estate markets, whether it's France or the UK and certainly the US. What we see is that luxury real estate has become this vehicle for widespread investment, but also possible money laundering on a very systematic scale.
And in fact, I think we've now hit the real reason why I had you on. Right? Obviously, it's a great book, and I want you to promote it. But I think that you have your work on this book, and generally speaking, your work in Central Asia and the former Soviet Union, I think give you some insight and some ability to maybe talk more about how these sort of networks of money laundering, of corruption, of moving large amounts of money around. Not all of it is illegal, right? But a lot of it certainly involves multiple shell companies and multiple nested investments. How this world, I guess to explain to our listeners who may not be familiar with it, how this world kind of interfaces with Donald Trump.
Yep. So it is an interesting sort of, collision of worlds, so to speak, right? So we were looking at the proofs right around the time of the election of Donald Trump. And, and in some senses, I thought to myself, well, given the upheaval that we're going to have in U.S. and world politics, what kind of interest is anyone going to have in sort of Central Asian extraterritorial authoritarianism and kleptocracy? And sort of I tried to forget about the book despondently. And then I started coming back to it, thinking that, in fact, I think the study of global kleptocracy is comparative and I think does transcend regions, right? And I think one of the things that we can learn from Central Asia is recast the way that we view these sorts of global nodes and global networks. I think sort of the first thing to keep in mind is that, no one considers themselves as an illicit actor or doing anything that's illegal, right? And that, in fact, the key to this world is that we have legal, unregulated professional sectors whose professional codes of ethics are relatively lax, and the regulation of these sectors is relatively unmonitored. And this is the kind of strategic environment in which global real estate investments take place. So it's a world where you
Can I just stop you here for a second? So yeah. I think you may have suggested this earlier, but this is a major reason why global real estate has become a place to stash money for dictators and oligarchs and just generally well-off people in countries with questionable rule of law, questionable property rights, risk of political upheaval, right? So you see this, from anywhere from elites in Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan and Tajikistan, wherever, to officials, right, who may not be getting their money in any way and kind of the up and up. And you see this in China as well, right, where there's lots of money from China. People have gotten very rich in a corrupt environment, but, more or less kind of legally sometimes, not just government officials, putting their money to Australia or the West Coast or what have you. So, and you're saying that the reason why so much money is flooding into the sector is precisely because it's lax and unregulated. It doesn't it's not like buying a company in the United States, for example.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So, in terms of sort of, disclosure and what are the obligations of, say, real estate brokers on the money laundering front, they're very loose. That, in fact, in the U.S., up until last year, and still ongoing, National Real Estate Brokers Association actually has an exemption from disclosure requirements under the Patriot Act. Last year, the Treasury, under the guidance of FinCEN, initiated a pilot program where all cash transactions in initially the Manhattan and then the Miami markets, over 3 million and 1 million respectively, where those transactions had to be logged and the beneficial owner, and I'll get to that in a sec, had to be recorded if the purchase was through an LLC. But even then, the obligation fell not on the real estate broker, but at the title insurance stage, right? So brokers themselves perceive themselves as providing something else, right? And that's client privacy, right? That is the opportunity to quietly and anonymously invest their cash. And what we've seen, especially since the financial crisis and the sort of explosion of the ultra luxury real estate market, are that these purchases are increasingly conducted through LLCs, anonymous shell companies that camouflage the identity of their actual owners. Now, why you want to do this, there's a couple of reasons, right? One is, as you mentioned, this kind of possible exit dynamic, right? If you are an official who's been involved in illicit or corrupt acts, that you want to be able to secure a place of residence overseas, and in some cases, actually buying property overseas does that. But two, you're not scared to overpay for an asset if it's essentially going to safeguard most of its value, right? And so I think one thing to remember, certainly in the Eurasian part of the world, elites have learned that power can be fleeting, right? Property rights can be insecure because many of them made their money in a flash off insider privatization schemes or, the monopolization of sort of strategic sectors. And so, it all can be ephemeral, it can be taken away from you, right? So putting money in real estate, and preferably multiple real estate holdings, is a hedge against that you have something of value. Then there's the sort of, the personal mobility dynamic here. And, you mentioned China, and there's a really interesting report, it was around 2007, 2008, by the Chinese People's Bank, the sort of central bank, that estimated there was in the realm of sort of 15 to 18,000 Chinese officials who had fled the country on corruption charges and had embezzled, upwards totally of $100 billion, $100 billions of dollars. And one of the findings of the report was the higher up that they were, the more likely they were to go to a place in the West that has no extradition arrangement with China. So part of the way we have to start thinking about kleptocracy and the dynamics of kleptocracy is what happens after you take the bribe, right? You need to get your money out, and you need to do it anonymously and effectively. So you do that with shell companies. You need destination havens, which are both foreign bank accounts and other potential stores of value. Real estate is one. International art market can be another. Perhaps you would like to buy a football club or something that's sort of highly visible, and that will sort of, protect you. And then you need to secure exit options for you and your family. So that involves things like purchasing residency overseas if you don't have a second passport. And this is why also since the financial crisis, we've seen the explosion of investor residency programs. Throughout the OECD, more than half of OECD countries since the financial crisis have come up with essentially some sort of program through which you can legally acquire residency and then citizenship through investments. And there are different requirements. Here we have a program, sort of $500,000 and creation of a certain number of jobs. In the UK, it's £1 million. What was interesting, and let's take the UK as an example, in the initial report from the Migration Service, they estimated that of, I think it was sort of the 16,000 initial visas, a quarter of them had been taken up, roughly a quarter by Chinese nationals, a quarter had been awarded to Russian nationals. So Chinese and Russian nationals were responsible about half of all the initial sort of UK investor visas. So this is really a dynamic. Yes, it's about taking money out and laundering it, but it's also dynamics of personal mobility and the use of this infrastructure that the West itself has created to then globalize yourself, your identity, your assets, and your family. I think one other aspect of this that viewers might find interesting is the sort of dynamic identified by Bill Browder in his book, Red Notice. And Browder, for some, is controversial figure who has been involved in pioneering the Magnitsky Act and pushing for it. I find Browder as a political theorist to be quite interesting, right? And one of the premises of sort of the smart sanctions and the individual sanctions in Magnitsky is explicitly, what do contemporary rulers care about? If you just sanction their countries, well, they're just going to sort of defer costs on their populations to begin with. So that's actually not an effective instrument. And Browder makes the argument that what they really care about is their global mobility, right, and their own assets. So what should you do? You should go after their assets overseas and try and freeze them when you identify them. And you should restrict their visas, their ability to sort of travel, because they do conduct themselves as global citizens. Their kids go to prestigious international schools. And whatever you think, the merits of the Magnitsky Act, whether it was sort of selective or not, or whether it's sort of a model of the future, I think the actual diagnosis by Browder is quite accurate. That a lot of these elites do think of themselves as operating on a global kind of plane. And I think we're only now starting to sort of, peel back and look at a lot of these spheres. And frankly, international political economy hasn't done a great job in looking some of these sectors that you would think are quite important, luxury real estate being one of them.
So you mentioned repeatedly since the financial crisis, right? And it's clear that in luxury real estate, or you mentioned art, we've seen enormous what look like asset bubbles, right? In these, art investments, et cetera, et cetera. My question is that because of something about that the financial crisis triggered, or is that because of the new regulations on banking and on finance and other kinds of financial instruments that might have driven money into those sectors, right? Because you've given a story kind of about how real estate is underregulated, but also a study about global mobility. Those things were all true prior to 2008, 2009. So what changed as a result of the Great Recession?
Right. So that's a really good question. I think it's probably a combination of the two factors that you pointed to. I think with increased scrutiny and regulation on straight out investment and banking activity, and also increased sort of compliance, right, and the adoption of certain types of software, the sort of rules on sort of identifying your client, that we've seen a kind of a hedging into other kinds of assets that can also become these stores of value. So I think there's definitely something to that. At the same time, my understanding from some of the real estate experts on this, and I'm not a real estate expert, I just sort of look at this through this kind of the global governance kind of lens, is that there's just fundamentally different infusions of international cash coming into global markets now than there were prior to the financial crisis. That the financial crisis, certainly here in the U.S., was caused by principally by a mortgage market that was aggressive, over borrowing, a bubble, aggressive lending practices, and the way that these got securitized and really got sent off to various as financial instruments to various sort of entities who are interested in buying them. What we're seeing now is a much different dynamic. It's an actual massive gush of international funds that are targeting markets, and the top 10 markets, according someone like Christie's, that comes up with their luxury real estate index. In the States, we have New York, Los Angeles, but the Côte d'Azur in Paris, London, Toronto, Vancouver is often talked about. It doesn't make most lists, but we see sort of that dynamic there. And what we see is far more Chinese money than we have before going into this, and also former Soviet cash going in. So, in part, I think it is the kind of globalization of their particular personas, and I would think of it not only as real estate, but I think what you've seen at the same time is attempts to image craft, right? That is to I'm going to say purchase influence, but improve their identities abroad and their reputations abroad. And how do you do that? You hire PR consultants. You provide money to think tanks to take on certain issues. Some people say universities are part of this, right? What's interesting when you think about kind of FARA disclosures, and that's been a very kind of hot
FARA
topic
disclosure
right
is
what foreign agent registry procedures, where if you're formally doing if you're working on behalf of a foreign government, say as a lobbyist or as an agent or go between, you should, according to the law, file a sort of a disclosure that you're doing this in paperwork. However, if you want to give money to a university or say an institute, although the gift itself is going to be scrutinized by say an international gifts committee that you have, you don't actually have the same legal obligation to do so. Ditto a think tank, right? If you are to give money to a think tank or to some other kinds of knowledge producing kind of center, and then there have been sort of questions raised about, say, Azeri and Kazakh money going into certain DC think tanks and how that's used or not, then those think tanks do not have the same level of disclosure obligations, say, a former lobbyist does. So I think one of the things that you've seen is this kind of creation of these multiple nodes of influence, image crafting, nation branding, as well as the kinds of fixers, the intermediaries that can link these different worlds together. And I think maybe that's another thing analytically to think about. None of these kinds of major players are going to say, oh, I'm an illicit figure, right? Or I do illegal things. Quite the opposite. They think of themselves as brokering these different worlds, making connections. Your luxury real estate broker in Manhattan that has extensive ties to Russia and Ukraine, chances are they're not only going to provide services in terms of finding suitable condos, but they'll be able to help with other things too. Do your kids need schools? Do you need, assistance in transitioning and relocating? Do you need a network and contact of people to socialize with or to get to know? In other words, there's a kind of, called social aspect of this kind of wealth management, right, and lifestyle management too, that they provide. So I think that leaves us in this sort of interesting position where, we've always assumed that there's a politics over there in the region, right? And I study sort of Central Asia and Eurasia, and a world over here, right? And when we study it over there, it's, comparative politics or foreign policy analysis, and when we study it here, it's sort of domestic politics, and we see really the blurring of the two, how these types of global networks facilitate these types of dynamics, whether the money of origin is Central Asian or American in nature. Which gets me to Trump, because I think that was your initial.
Yeah, so let me stop you here for a second, because I want to prompt you on Trump. So in 2000, so in a sense what you're saying is, and this is Donald Trump Jr. saying, oh, there's all this Russian money pouring in, this is so great. But after the global financial crisis, roughly the last 6, 7 years, right, it sounds like this has been manna from heaven for the Trumps, the Kushners, real estate developers who are probably very over leveraged, are not getting access to bank loans on the strength of their own credit anymore, and all of a sudden there's this money flooding it, right? But so to get access to this money, they need to be dealing with lots of people from Russia, Central Asia, etc., China, right? They need to be recruiting them. They need to be courting them. And you need a host of people who are particularly there, who are either very good at it or there in a kind of cloud to link them up, right?
Yep.
I think Goldstone, for example, right? In terms of the Moscow beauty pageant, we'll come back to that in a second, because that's actually a kind of different kind of transaction than we're talking about.
Right.
So if that's your world, right, you're suddenly kind of meeting and engaged with all these people, who, as you say, don't think of themselves as criminals, and their wealth has come from a variety of ways, but by Western standards, it wouldn't be legitimate wealth. Right? It would be wealth that had been arrived at through kleptocratic means or through cozy deals with the government. So you're kind of dealing with this money all the time, right? So that sort of puts you into this network, right? It plugs you into it. Beyond that, what's interesting is listening to you talk, it kind of puts a different spin on all the kind of grumbling that Donald Trump was doing about, regulatory frameworks during the campaign, right? I can imagine that the attempts to now come in and regulate this sector, things like the Majinsky Act, are probably a real problem, right? If you're a Trump or you're running the Christian businesses or whatever, because they make it harder to get this kind of money. There are more legal hoops to jump through. Is that right?
Yeah, I think that's certainly a big piece of it. I mean, the way I think about it is, what is the strategic operating environment of global luxury real estate that the Trumps or the Kushners find themselves in, right? And it's a sector that's, highly unregulated, monitoring, is relatively lax, that people all the time present themselves as fronts or connectors to interested sort of mega investors. There's a kind of, positionality where you want to sort of, exaggerate your kind of importance, but also the fact that you're brokering different worlds, right? The worlds of business, the world of sort of government for protection. And this is why, intel and security services are also wrapped up in this part of the world, right? That these distinctions that we have between different sectors, right? The conduct of foreign policy, the conduct of security policy, internal security versus external security versus intelligence gathering, that these worlds tend to meld. And sometimes, individuals can have their hand, in 3 or 4 of these different sort of sectors, simultaneously.
And some of them because they have to, right? Because that is the environment. This is what genuine kleptocracy looks like.
Exactly right. And then you need protection. You need connections. You need the ability to sort of freely take money in and out of the country, and also to yourself move in and out the country and facilitate this. That's right.
And in fact, a lot of the people involved in this are very high-ranking, perhaps highest-ranking government officials. So you have that, right? There is no business, as you say, there is no business public service distinction, at least in practice.
Not only is there no business public service distinction, it's that positions of public service are commodities, right? That you monetize them, that, why wouldn't you use your public position? And in fact, the more money you make, for some is an example of how skilled you are at doing it, right?
And I suspect that I would just suspect that this doesn't even necessarily, like, we would read this and we would say this must mean you're evil and corrupt, right? Or self-dealing and corrupt. But I imagine that if you're in that kind of environment, this is just a reward for doing your job well for a lot of people. You can still be looking out for the interests of the state as you understand them and getting quite rich.
Yeah, and I think, there's a lot of public sectors that are very, poorly paid. And so that's why you have, a lot of parallel systems and, education and health and sort of, petty bureaucracy where, sometimes there's two tiers. There's like the normal way and there's the sort of expedited way of sort of providing services sort of for fees. But I think the point is that, certainly across Eurasia, these salaries themselves are insufficient to sort of live on. So then, you engage in sort of certain, side projects. But that, that's the petty corruption, right? That's the sort of corruption of, the analogy there is of sort of, the kind of, police officers with the little wands, on a street corner in Central Asia, sort of, flagging down, cars and taking sort of little envelopes of bribes from them, right?
Or the old stories about speeding tickets between Kiev and the airport, right?
Yeah, exactly. What we're looking at in sort of this luxury real estate realm is something bigger, right? And which is sort of, high levels of power and access and influence being used. And I think where it gets interesting for sort of IR scholars is, when does this actually become a mode of foreign policy, right? When does the sort of retaining access, preserving one's own wealth and networks become a part of the foreign policy priorities of the state, right? And I'll give you a sort of contemporary example from the book, which I think actually does have a Trump connection. You just give me sort of, a couple of minutes. So one of the chapters in the book concerns the activities of Mukhtar Ablyasov. Now, Ablyasov is such a fascinating figure analytically because the narratives that he has versus what the Kazakh government has are completely different, right? He was head of the BTA bank that collapsed during the financial crisis, again, having invested very heavily in real estate development, places like Moscow and Georgia. And he fled to London during the financial crisis when his bank was taken over by the Kazakh government, essentially through the Sovereign Wealth Fund. The Kazakh government accuses him of having concealed the embezzlement of billions of dollars, something that he denies, through multiple hundreds of shell companies in very complicated types of transactions, kind of an Enron of Kazakhstan. If you believe him, he responds by saying the reason he used all these shell companies was to hide his assets from appropriation by Kazakh regulators and Nazarbayev himself. So Ablyasov now flees to London and he starts setting up opposition newspapers, beaming in opposition, what he calls independent media, and also starts networking a bunch of different sort of exiles through his presence there, and he is a self-styled democratic champion, right? So the Kazakh government starts using instruments of foreign policy to go after him and his associates, right? They issue red notices for his accountant, his security services provider, different associates affiliate with the banks, and they put pressure on diplomats to coordinate with law enforcement and prosecutors in places like Poland, Czech Republic, Spain, to pick up these associates on these accusations, usually of money laundering, but there's a few sort of accusations of terrorism sort of thrown in there too. The most egregious example of this is in Italy, right, where Italian essentially sort of special units pick up his wife and his daughter who are in Rome and essentially conduct a rendition with the Kazakh ambassador reportedly on the private jet and take them back to Kazakhstan, right? And The UN sort of declares that this is in fact an extraordinary rendition and illegal. Eventually, they're allowed to return back to Italy. But the point here is that in all of these cases, the pattern emerges where, these sorts of networks of influence that the Kazakh government has, they pick up these associates. But at some point during a legal hearing, especially an upper level legal hearing, all these cases are found to be politically motivated. And that these various actors are essentially freed based either on the fact that these cases are too political, or that there's a determination of sort of political asylum here. And they're all essentially thrown out, and these associates are freed. And the latest example was the Conseil d'État, the highest level administrative court in France, halting the extradition of Ablyasov, who was in southern France and been detained and scheduled to be extradited, on accounts that this was politically motivated. So this is sort of a mode where you go after political opponents with the full reach of the state, and then you try and protect what you have also with the full foreign policy and security apparatus that you have. And it's this commingling of your private political and your private financial interests with the instruments of foreign policy, with the instruments of security policy, that I would argue at some times, not always, rises to the level of a kind of an ordering mechanism, right? Or at least one way in which kleptocracies might behave differently than other types of polities.
I mean, the interesting flip side of that, of course, is that, and we've seen this pattern with certain Russian oligarchs who then flee to the West, is that they also, part of the reason why these figures can have their extradition blocked or get asylum on political grounds is, in fact, they do become political opponents of the government, right. Which I think suggests just how commingled politics and business are under these circumstances.
Yeah.
Before we move forward, because I know I have a sense from conversations we had before, but also from where we're going to wind up converging in a few minutes. But before we do that, I want to go back. So we've talked a lot about the luxury real estate market and changes that happened after the Great Recession. But of course, somebody like Donald Trump has been trying to do business or doing business in the former Soviet Union in one way or another for much longer, right? In fact, he initially tried during the Soviet era. So what would it mean, or what does it mean for somebody like Donald Trump to be trying to do deals in Azerbaijan, or trying to do deals in the former Soviet Union in terms of the kinds of connections he's making, the kinds of figures he's getting involved with, what he needs to do to make that happen?
Well, to make that happen, essentially you need the purchase of ruling elite and the ruling class, right? These deals are never not going to be approved at the highest level, right? Usually it's going to be through an intermediary, or a minister or deputy minister, or some sort of regulator, but you need buying at the highest level, right? So, in the case of Georgia, for instance, some of the reporting that's happened on this was how this was going to be part of the renovation of the Black seaport of Batumi that Mikhail Saakashvili, the very kind of flamboyant and publicly very pro-Western sort of figure, but wanted to remake that entire city and build it up and turn it into a kind of a luxury entertainment and casino world, right? That would be sort of, a jewel in the Caucasus and regionally would attract someone. So someone like him would have to sign off, or those interests would be, co-determined with someone like Trump. And then Trump was, in fact, looking at a Batumi tower for a while. So you're going to have elite buy-in. You're going to have to, at some point, provide some sort of economic incentive, as sort of a side payment. And this is a part of the world where, these kinds of licenses, and we know from sort of other sectors where we have, thorough and detailed investigations aren't just sort of given away, right? And so violations of the FCPA are incredibly sort of time consuming to prove and investigate and so forth. But we do have this other kind of extraterritorial legal dimension because of sort of U.S. law that also, I think, is potentially a really interesting governance issue when we talk about, is it possible that Trump might extend this kind of mode of commingling his sort of business interests and personal interests. And, I think, to me, to come back to sort of current affairs, this is where I think caution is really needed and vigilance. Traditionally, this extraterritorial judicial and regulatory power that we have, that justice has operated. Sometimes there've been sort of accusations that there are sort of broader sort of geopolitical agendas. Certainly in the case of Kazakhstan, but I would sort of emphasize that these tracks have been separate, right? So when a Central Asian oligarch or elite goes to sort of the State Department and says, why there's this investigation of me and dealings going on or my family, why can't you just make them go away? They're very inconvenient for our relations, right? And State Department officials presumably say, well, we don't have jurisdiction over the DOJ and what it does in, say, a sort of a telecoms case. Or, an oil and gas case or whatever it happens to be.
It actually reminds me of stories I used to hear about, when elites in certain countries would complain about coverage, for example,
yes.
in the in Radio Free Europe, RFA,
Exactly.
RFL, or in VOA or whatever, the answer would always be, well, look, we've got a free press. We don't touch this kind of stuff, right?
Right. No, these are sort of, these are sort of separate spheres and they're not geopolitical. Well, of course, in a kleptocracy or most autocracies, they're completely the same thing, right? Of course, you have jurisdiction over sort of legal proceedings and you use them as, instruments of sort of statecraft and possibly sort of, your personal agendas and so forth. And so you get this, interesting kind of, subdynamic of a lot of these countries, sort of testing how firm that wall is, right, in terms of the formal bilateral relationship of the country. And for the most part, it's held together. I think one of the tests of this administration, right, and whether, in fact, because we've talked a lot about the strain on democratic institutions here, how norms are being sort of railroaded and rolled back, but I think this is a really big one that I'd like to see sort of more attention paid to. Is the Justice Department going to retain its independence to vigorously prosecute money laundering cases, violations of the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, or is this an area that gets risk being politicized?
Now, this is an area, right? I know that your concern here isn't simply that Trump and his crew, right, his family, the people around him. I know your concern is not simply that they stop enforcing this stuff, right? Your concern is also that they start that they follow this Central Asian and former Soviet and Chinese and other pattern, which is that they start selectively enforcing it for political purposes. Exactly. Could you talk a little bit about that?
So I think that's exactly the concern. It's not that the DOJ is going to stop is just going to throw out the FCPA, although, I think we should be concerned as, there's some, rollback in transparency in oil and gas that we've seen already and so forth. But the DOJ itself, these units are going to do what they've always done. It's rather that at the highest level, you start getting an either political pressure on certain cases for friendly regimes to either be halted or perhaps to be settled in a much more sort of favorable fashion than they otherwise would be, right? That could be one. Or that you get, and I don't think this is out of the realm of possibility, sort of collusion or pressure to go after overseas political regime opponents, right? Who might be in the possible sights of the DOJ or the SEC.
Now,
So
we should. I just want to interrupt you for a second here, because the particular problem here is that, to be frank, regardless of their political orientations or their good works, we're primarily talking about people who have some sort of criminal record, right? By American standards, right? I mean, none of these people are clean. So it would seem to me that one of the dangers there is that enforcement will appear to people entirely justified, right? The problem is the selectivity. Right.
And this is exactly what we've seen has happened in Central Asia.
Right. And in Russia. Right. As well.
Yeah. And in Russia and throughout Eurasia is that, in essence, it's sort of the new compromise, right? If you were in government, right, and you were an associate, say you were a minister of energy, right, or a minister of construction, or the mayor of a city, right, and you've been exposed to sort of, these networks, insider privatization, kind of sort of sketchy deals that sort of push the envelope, you're essentially complicit. The minute that you bolt, right, from the regime, right, the minute that you find yourself on the outside and you make the decision to leave, you are now vulnerable to international actions in the sort of anti-money laundering and anti-corruption kinds of units, right? And so, governments then will try trigger investigations against you. Will send sort of regulators against you. One of the ironies of Kazakhgate, and I don't know if this is sort of, kind of a broader warning, but Steve Levine wrote a really good post about this, was that initially one of the origins of Kazakhgate, how this whole scheme was uncovered, was that the Kazakh government had put Swiss officials on notice to go after a former prime minister, Kazagheldin, who had gone into exile in Switzerland, and to look for suspicious transactions between Switzerland and Kazakhstan. But lo and behold, they found suspicious transactions, but those were traced to actual government elites, not to Kazagheldin himself, right? So it can be this imperfect weapon. But yeah, it's exactly that sort of selectivity. Like, once you turn against the regime, you are vulnerable because everyone was in on it. And to a law enforcement professional, there might well be sort of, plausibility and evidence regarding the case. It's just, what are the motivations behind using it, right? And I think that's where the potential danger comes, whether it starts becoming a tool of statecraft, given its really powerful extraterritorial reach, as well as sort of, personal politicking, as opposed to what it is now, which is supposed to be this sort of, walled off, separate, legal and governance kind of function that we play.
And we should highlight that because, we have a lot of debates now about what the effect of Trumpism is on U.S. leadership, but the fact remains that in these arenas, in extraterritorial jurisdiction and law enforcement capability, global law enforcement reach, the U.S. really is kind of in a class by itself, right?
It absolutely is. I mean, think about the FIFA scandal, right? And the corruption scandal, right? Where, a lot of the evidence, a lot of the reporting has been uncovered by U.S. entities, right? And sort of transactions that have been sort of taken place within, the U.S. financial network, sort of giving us jurisdiction on this. And in fact, this is, uncovering the corruption in a lot of these sort of, bids and cleaning up FIFA has been, frankly, a U.S.-led type of project, right? And maybe it hasn't made the U.S. popular with certain of these sort of federations that have been in on it. But when Putin was complaining about the extraterritorial reach of sort of, U.S. law and enforcement, regarding sort of FIFA, I would take that as an example of, that's a good thing, right? In that it was used in the way that it's professed it's supposed to be used. And so this is really a unique kind of function that the U.S. plays on a global scale de facto. And I think compromising it would be very dangerous. But I think the warning is exactly what you said, that it's not that these functions are going to cease or be stopped. It's that there's going to be a slow drip of perhaps selective enforcement or perhaps compromised kind of enforcements. And then I think that opens the door to this whole other area that I don't think we've talked about as a potential outspring of kind of what I see as the illiberal tendencies in this administration.
So given this discussion, you saw the Congressional House Judiciary Democrats' letter to the Department of Justice. Does that kind of thing, I mean, is that worry you?
Yeah, no, this was exactly the flag that raised to me, right? And we don't know. And again, I want to sort of stress, what happened, but it's certainly worth pursuing that this sort of very abrupt termination of a case that was hundreds of millions of dollars potentially were settled for $6 million, right? Was this, what were the reasons for this? What role did this intermediary play? Natalia Veselnitskaya that was also involved in this, where was the decision taken? I think it opens the door to something that can be a lot more systemic, I think, than we realize. And so that's why I think sort of following up hard on this is really important and investigating it so it doesn't actually set a standard or a trend.
So part of the lesson of all this is not simply about the fact that, we need to understand Trump and his business partners as being embedded in these sort of very shady networks, that perhaps, whether or not he himself is legally compromised, there's a lot of stuff kind of going on there that creates these lateral connections, which is, we now are looking at when we look at, some of the mechanisms, the revelation about the meeting, right, seems to kind of be largely in these kinds of business contacts, which may or may not be bootstrapped on by intelligence services, but are certainly in an environment where the lines between business and politics are just, or government are just not, they're not how we think about them, right?
They're not how we think, they're not how we, go on. They're not how we think about them. And then I think there's also this other thing that goes on in the strategic operating environment, which is sort of, a lot of post hoc re-narration and fixing, right? And so, you lie about a meeting or you don't disclose it or you omit it. Why? Because you can make up for it after the fact, right? You do your deal. If you need to, you lawyer up. Maybe you lean on a regulator. Maybe you threaten legal action in a very kind of sort of brazen, sort of arm twisting way. The norms are different than, I think, the investigation of a federal government, right? And so that's why I think, whatever comes out about, Trump and what has or hasn't happened, I think we have to accept that, the transplantation of the world of sort of luxury real estate and the way that you operate and the way that you enforce and make up for things after the fact and sort of threaten and cajole is not a perfect fit for running a federal government, right? Where then, a lot of these actions then have immediate consequences, right? And trigger another investigation on why you did things in the certain manner that you did. And I don't want to use this as a benign explanation for Trump, right? I don't know, again, how far these accusations of, collusion or actually extend. But I do think we need to sort of keep in mind that there's a sense that Trump and his associates have always managed to wriggle out of situations, have always managed to fight themselves out of situation because that's their life experience, right? And then that's what they've actually managed to do by identifying the right people, doubling down, having, very aggressive sort of lawyers, making things very costly to potential sort of political opponents. And it's their mode of operation.
So, and we're actually seeing hints of that already when we think about the game plan for defending Donald Jr. that's been released, which is essentially to just do private investigation style stuff on any reporter who says something negative about him as a way of discrediting them. I mean, it really does kind of feel like that. Some people have likened it to to the mafia, but it sounds like it's sort of standard operating procedure in the world.
The standard operating procedure is to always go after the messenger and question the motives, the agenda, and the financing of the messenger, as opposed to the principle involved, right? The actual act involved.
Yeah,
right?
And the other thing about that I think was interesting was that, I've been saying that Trump has crossed the impeachment Rubicon since he fired Comey under false pretenses and then admitted that he had fired him for the very reasons that was transparently obvious he did. So I'm not an unbiased observer here, but I will say that until the revelation about the meeting, right, I was not convinced that he was really trying to hide sort of cloak and dagger collusion, and rather that he was just he was trying to prevent the federal government from looking really, really closely at all these kinds of business activities that you say he sort of skirted through. Now maybe it could be both, right? But it certainly sounds like, you can, even if you're relatively clean in this world, right, even if you sort of do your best, and it's not clear that's the way Trump's ever operated, you can accumulate a lot of stuff, right, that's prosecutable, right, if somebody really, really wants to go after you. Is that correct?
Well, we're going to see. I mean, I think, the big question here is, what is the relationship between a lot of these overseas oligarchs, these investors, and these LLCs that then invested in various sort of Trump luxury properties, right? And whether, some of them were consciously doing this in order to launder money and to, take out overseas, or embezzle rather funds, knowingly. And then I think that's where it gets really potentially shady and where it gets dicey. Trump or his representatives would say, well, look, I don't know who my investors are. I just accept sort of LLCs and, wherever they are. And so then the question is, what's the standard of sort of know thy client due diligence that was applied to a lot of these transactions? Usually, it's pretty, it's not as rigorous as it is to say banking transactions.
So essentially,
right? But I think that's what we're going to see.
So it's essentially thin but adequate to avoid criminality. So maybe instead of what I was sort of throwing out, the question is not so much that you wind up in jail for these activities, but you wind up with your brand pretty in tatters, or politically you wind up with a lot of stuff that you probably don't want to be talking about. Is that the case?
Well, I mean, I think all of those are on the table, right? That there might be, might be possible,
we're just speculating. Right?
Criminal violations, looking into sort of money laundering. That's one aspect of this. But certainly, the branding of properties is the business, right? That's, from what I can see, that's the business model. And so if that is tainted, right, if that becomes sort of globally associated, with something that's not on the up and up, or gets intertwined with political scandal, or even kakistocracy, or just, sort of plain incompetence, then, the value of the Trump organization is probably going to diminish globally. So I think, it's all intertwined, right? It's all on the line, in the same way. And
this is, I think, what's been actually more frightening to me as a political scientist than any of the sort of, really then at a kind of deeper level than, kind of did Trump do X or did Trump do Y? It's what I've heard from a lot of people who study the region that you study, who look at Trump, and I think the language I used in a recent blog post is, they see something they've seen before. And then they see those practices potentially starting to infect the U.S. government, right? And so even if, frankly, at the end of the day, these people are relatively benign, right? In the sense that, they want to make some money, they want to improve their brand, but they're not really going to be selling out the U.S. in any particular way.
Right.
It still looks problematic from a kind of law and order norm kind of perspective.
It's problematic, and that's why our norms traditionally have been so powerful, because even the appearance of conflict is usually the standard, right, that we apply to positions of power in government, certainly to sort of when we're conducting investigations and conflicts of interest and so forth. We have very high thresholds and strict guidelines and norms, usually because we don't want to go into that slippery slope. We don't want to start normalizing and then sort of saying, well, taking a little bit off the top is fine if you're still going to, sort of promote, the interests of the country. In practice, it doesn't really work that way. And that's why I think normative rollback is as important as any kind of legal infractions, right? Once we stop losing that, we're in a very different mode, which, I agree is a mode that's sort of familiar to, observers of Eurasia, but also other regions of the world.
Sure. Parts of Africa, parts of Asia, parts of Latin America. I mean, Brazil, we could talk about, somebody involved in foreign entanglements should do a podcast on Brazil with somebody who's an expert on it if we haven't already. Why don't you show us your book? Do you have a copy of it so we can plug it?
Yes, thank you for the plug. Here we go.
Right.
Dictators Without Borders.
And I actually haven't read it, I'm ashamed to say, and I usually avidly read all of your work. I have to because we co-author stuff. But if we could just close out, my understanding is that a lot of the research for this is actually based on court documents, right? Is that correct? That you basically, going through these records of these trials, you found this kind of treasure trove of information about the way that the global political economy of this stuff actually works. Is that right?
Yep. Yeah, legal proceedings and arbitration proceedings that are public. Many of them aren't, but many of them are. And sometimes you find the most remarkable kinds of statements made in, say, proceedings over which country has jurisdiction in a bit, right? And then you start sort of unpeeling the different layers of sort of who owns what and in what network and so forth. But there's a kind of a serious methodological point that John and I wanted to have, and that is, it's very difficult to conduct research on this kind of stuff. You don't want to have private sources and private interviews because that also exposes you potentially to sort of questions of sort of, verification and possible sort of legal considerations. So John and I from the outset said we were only going to use public sources of this because we had seen enough of this spanning really all the governments or all the or not all the officials, but all officials involved in all 5 sort of Central Asian governments. We thought, there's a pattern here and there's enough out there in terms of what we know to be able to get the big bare bones of the stories out there. And, if other researchers want to pick up a particular case here, right, look at Turkmen gas deals and intermediary companies, or look at, the telecom scandals in Uzbekistan that have been huge, or whatever they want to do, they can go ahead and they can pursue that. But what we have already on the record is really substantial. It just involves a little bit of digging and a little bit of research. And then sort of the other aspect of this that I would point to, that we didn't do this ourselves, we also referenced, some of the interesting experimental work that people like Jason Sharman have done, right? And in his big with his co-author sort of examination of sort of testing the norms of LLCs, I think 600 of those observations were impersonating corrupt Central Asian figures, right, involved in government procurement to see if they could sort of buy a shell company anonymously, and they did. And so I think, there's a kind of.
We should say about this and we do need to wrap this up, but we should say about Jason and his collaborators' work, which is that they actually, for all this talk about corruption in these regions of the world, they found that the places that were least responsive in terms of transparency were in the United States, right? Yeah. They were Delaware and Nevada and places like that. That's
exactly right. Delaware, Wyoming, and Nevada, as opposed to the so-called tax havens, that they were the ones that were more likely to sort of sell you an anonymous company without demanding sort of identification, notarized identification documents. And in that spirit, this book with John is very much about those lines. It's about the Western spaces, actors, and institutions that facilitate kleptocracy and authoritarianism that are, professional networks, professional services here in the West. And that's what we found interesting. So I think, very much in the spirit of what Jason found regarding sort of shell companies. I think you can sort of extend that out to questions of second citizenship acquisition and investor visas, luxury real estate, image crafting and branding, PR efforts and so forth. You can identify other kinds of sort of Western actors and spaces that facilitate this.
And I think that's as good an any of a place to end this. Thank you so much for coming on, and I'm sure we can do this again at some point to discuss the high politics, the traditional strategic relationship as it evolves with Russia. So thanks so much.
Thanks for having me, Dan.
All right, bye.
Take care. Bye.